There are millions today that have been traumatized by different aspects of religion. Think of war veterans who have PTSD, except this thing is caused by people like your pastor at your church, or the lady you don't like in Sunday school, or even your parents. Sound crazy? No. If taught incorrectly, teaching beliefs like hell, original sin, and many other mainstream Christian beliefs can have extremely damaging effects to people. Today, we're talking with Dr. Darren Slade, who's going to explain how religious trauma occurs and what we should do about it. Today, I am on with Dr. Darren Slade. We're going to be talking about religious trauma and how it affects people. How are you doing today, Dr. Slade?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay, can you give us a little bit about your background, your organization, and just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have a PhD in theology and church history, and I am the president of the Global Center for Religious Research. I'm also a professor at a little college here in Denver, Colorado, where I teach ancient history, comparative religion and mythology, worldviews, things like that. And I am also currently the general editor for the academic journal SHRM, or Socio-Historical Examination of Religion and Ministry, is the long title, and the director of the North American Committee on Religious Trauma Research.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. And uh, so, just tell us a little bit about like what your resources are as far as religious trauma. Like, if they want to, learn more about it or just learn more about the topic, you've got some certifications. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have two kind of different versions depending on maybe what your needs are. But basically, we have an entire certification program for pastors and ministers or people in professional ministry, and also clinicians, things like life coaches, counselors, and therapists, or just professional researchers. And what this entails is 32 hours of training material, video lectures from some of the world's most prominent researchers and scholars and specialists on religious trauma. Take that course. At the very end, you get a certification, and that certification actually can be used to submit for CEUs, or continuing education units. And that's mostly prominent, that's mostly relevant for clinicians. Now, if somebody is just more interested in some kind of intro brief stuff to religious trauma, or you yourself might be a survivor or a sufferer from religious trauma and you don't need the full certification, we also have what we call the expert video library, which is just kind of the certification course shrunk down with just the presentations. You don't have to worry about getting certifications or anything like that. And all you have to do is go to www.gcrr.org/RT if you want to learn more about it.
Awesome. Okay, and you've got a coupon code for people so they can get a discount, right?
Absolutely. It's just your name, Zach.
Zach, Zach. It'll be on the screen. Okay, this is awesome. Yeah, I've been watching, going through it. I think I'm on like video 5 or 6, and it's been really great. A lot of awesome stuff, and I'm already reaching out to some people to even do more interviews and get even more content. But I would highly recommend going to enroll in that course. So let's talk about religious trauma. What is that?
Yeah, it's just trauma. And that might sound like I'm minimizing it, and I don't mean to be, because trauma is a big deal. But it's important to know that religious trauma is just trauma, but it is trauma that has been created or caused from within a religious context. And those who suffer from religious trauma have a disruption in their nervous system. Trauma affects both your brain and your body, to where your nervous system gets activated by certain things, where you might find yourself having what you think of like PTSD symptoms, nightmares, extreme stress or anxiety, depression, fear. You might lash out in anger at some of the simplest or dumbest things. You might see a group of people trying to share the gospel out on a street corner with some signs, and you get enraged. Well, something as kind of benign as evangelists out on the street shouldn't have that effect on you, but your nervous system gets activated because you might have some religious trauma.
Hmm.
Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And of course, we're gonna get in some more examples of that. As a brief side note, I want to make it abundantly clear that if you are someone that has been affected by religious trauma, you are completely justified in feeling the way you do. You are not damaged goods, and there is hope. Additionally, if you feel like one of the theological views we talked about just can't be right because of what has been said, I'd highly recommend looking into other views that are backed by scripture, of which there are many, that plenty of God loving Christians believe. Feel free to comment in the description if you want some recommendations. So, you talked about in previous lectures that there's been some people that like you'll ask them like, hey, do you have religious trauma or whatever? And then they'll say no. And then later, like you start talking about like different things and you realize that what they're talking about seems like religious trauma, but they say they don't have it. So how does that make sense to you?
And so, what in fact is happening is a couple of things. One, they contradicted themselves for sure. They say they don't have religious trauma, but then they identify as basically having it. So they should have said yes in the first place. And when we ask why didn't you say yes, the answer falls down to a number of possibilities.
Okay.
One, it could have been a simple just error, a mistake. They didn't quite understand what religious trauma was. But also, more likely, is the stigma around
Hmm.
the word trauma and the stigma around saying that religion has maybe negatively impacted your life.
Hmm.
It is still a taboo subject. And for many communities and many people, to even hint that your faith community may have actually done you harm and damage, you run the risk of being ostracized,
Hmm.
or if it doesn't even come out publicly, internally, you might have the anxiety, the fear that you are going to betray God or displease God
Hmm.
by admitting that religion may have hurt you. So there's definitely reasons why somebody might contradict themselves and not fully want to embrace the trauma label.
All right, so that sounds like there could be a lot of people listening here that they hear, okay, think to themselves like, do I have religious trauma? And like maybe there's a large amount of people that like maybe don't understand it completely, or might not like be cognitively thinking, oh, there's these symptoms or whatever. So just to say that like, people listening should have an open mind, like this isn't like some like shame thing, right? Like is that something you should be ashamed of?
Yeah, absolutely not. Um, Sadly, trauma can happen anywhere at any time.
Hmm.
And most of us have been exposed to very traumatic things, especially coming out of the pandemic like we are, but also just from generation after generation after generation of being raised by war veterans and um, people who, in mass shootings. We are being exposed to traumatic things on a daily basis.
Hmm.
Here's the thing: trauma isn't just debilitating, it will cause long term, lasting adverse effects on you, your brain, and your body, but it will do far worse. It's going to damage relationships, it
Hmm.
will kill you early on. Your marriages will crumble because of it, or your relationship with your kids. You are going to be in a miserable state if you leave your trauma untreated.
Hmm.
So, whether there's a taboo about it, whether there's some stigma around it, just know that there's help and resources out there. And the problem is not going to go away on its own. In fact, it could potentially get worse for you.
Hmm. Fascinating. Okay. And yeah, I'm really excited to see what kind of solutions we have there. So, yeah, what is the most common religious trauma?
Yeah, do you mean the most common
Causes?
causes?
Yeah, causes.
Yeah. Well, we actually distinguish between two things. So
Okay.
um, there are what we call AREs, adverse religious experiences. Now, those
Okay.
are what you think of as the causes. The trauma is what happens to the body afterwards,
Mm,
the lasting effects. So, in terms of the adverse religious experiences, we are discovering that there is an entire array of things that are causing it. So, some of the most some of the biggest, most prevalent ones is just how people have been treated by church members, by the pastors. So
hmm.
things like um, an inability to express your beliefs,
Oh,
your
yeah.
opinions, and being shut down in a very traumatic way. So think of people in the LGBTQ community who have a different sexual orientation or gender identity. They are terrified of um, coming out, or they're terrified of what's going on inside them, and they hear sermons about that they're going to burn in hell. And if they were to be outed or exposed, or they come out and admit to themselves, then suddenly they're told that they are possessed by demons, or they need to go to gay therapy kind of stuff. These things are very traumatic. It could also be something as mundane as believing in the rapture. And I know that sounds silly because for the most of us,
Hmm.
um, kind of doctrinal type of theologies like that don't really affect us. However, I would say that some of the two biggest ones
Hmm.
is the belief in original sin, and things like rapture have actually done a lot of harm and damage for people. So, for instance, we are now more aware of how rapture theology has caused a lot of heights phobia, people who are afraid of heights in people, because they're terrified that at any moment the Lord's going to return and they're going to be floating up into the sky. Um, or, and probably a bit more prevalent, when somebody is in has sinned. Let's say they've had some impure thoughts or are acting on the impure thoughts. There's an immediate guilt and shame, but then an immediate fear. What if the rapture happened right now? Would I be one of them?
Hmm.
So, a constant feeling that I'm never measuring up. God is going to punish me and he's out to get me. I'm terrified of my salvation constantly. Um, that intense scrupulosity, or kind of an OCD pattern type behavior where
Hmm.
I'm always saying the Lord's name. I'm sorry, I'm always saying the Lord's prayer, the sinner's prayer, and hoping that I'm pleasing the Lord. Or for me, whenever I used to hear somebody cuss or say God's name in vain, I would, in my head, I would say, I would pray, please forgive me, Jesus, because I heard it echo in my head. And so I thought, oh my God, did I also sin with that person?
That's amazing.
Um, Original sin seems to be a big one. This notion that, and the way it's being taught, especially at young ages, it doesn't seem to be developmentally appropriate to tell kids that when they sin or disobey mommy, that they have in fact murdered Jesus, that they're
Hmm.
responsible for his torture and death on the cross, and that you are born evil and you're going to go to hell unless you say some magic words. Um, this we're finding has actually caused a lot of damage in people.
Hmm. Okay, so so when you talk about damage, I mean you're talking about like someone says, "Hey, there's a rapture," and they're afraid of heights because of might what happen if they get raptured, and you're saying that people like what they have depression or anxiety because of that. Like, Can you talk
Yeah,
about that? Like people are really, I mean, so to people that are not familiar with like trauma, that's going to sound absolutely ridiculous. Like these people are crazy. Can you talk about what they'll say that, of course, I don't think they're crazy for thinking that. I think they're totally justified and, for whatever reason. But what is causing that? Like, why would someone ever conclude, like, be scared of that? Like, help people understand.
yeah, absolutely. Well, when I'm talking about kind of the damage that can be done, we're talking about interpersonal, emotional, and cognitive difficulties.
Hmm.
So think of PTSD,
Hmm.
where somebody wakes up in night sweats, or a good portion of their sleep experiences are nightmares, and the nightmares are of them being raptured, but it's a terrifying experience in those dreams.
Hmm.
Think of the person who, you'll have to forgive me, I'm trying to wait for my little one because she's making noise. I'm glad this isn't live.
There you go. Nice.
Um, all right, I'm gonna pick up. Think of somebody with PTSD who is also um, enraged by some of the simplest stuff, things that they can't quite understand. They're always almost on a level of simmering, always
Hmm.
angry or about ready to explode. So somebody cuts them off in traffic and they flip out. It's like they see red, they go into their own brain, and they just turn into a completely different person.
Hmm.
These are PTSD symptoms. What is basically happening, because the symptoms can manifest in a whole bunch of different ways
Hmm.
depending on the person.
Right.
For some people, they go into a fight mode. Other people, they go into a freeze mode where they just completely shut down. Other people go into a fawn mode where they become people pleasers and doormats, right? What is basically happening is your brain has taken a past trauma and made neurological connections to it. So that present day experiences trigger a neurological response where your brain immediately enters into that fight or fight mode.
Hmm.
And and you can't help it. It's a complete automated system. So you see the preachers on the street corner, and suddenly, boom, your brain connects that to a past trauma, thinks you are in danger now. You
Hmm.
flip into a fight mode, or you flip into a flight mode where you're taking off, you're running, you're having panic attacks, anxiety attacks, sweating, hyperventilating. Um, these types of things happen to the brain. Boom, neurological connection. You go into that mode, and it can be disruptive. It's terrifying, not just for you, but the people around you. These are types of things that we actually are seeing a lot of all over the place,
Hmm.
right? So it's not just religion that's causing it, obviously. But what we're finding is that religious doctrines and practices, and of course, just terrible abuses like sex assault, right,
Hmm.
is causing this for a ton of people. Does that
Hmm.
answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So, um, so you've mentioned some, a big one is hell. I don't know if you talked about that one yet. I'll be interviewing Dr. Mark Karras tomorrow, actually, on the topic of hell, which of course he's
Yes,
written about. Um,
perfect one.
yeah, and so, but original sin, hell. So like, a lot of people think like, okay, I've never experienced that. I'm not afraid of hell. But then obviously you have, people that even deconvert or people that are still Christians that are just freaking out about hell. They have dreams every night that they're scared of hell. Scared of hell. Some people don't even believe in Christianity and they're still scared of hell.
Yeah.
Or how does that make any sense? So can you talk about why we would have some people that don't have an issue at all, and then some people in the same circumstances do like experience this trauma here?
Well, we don't know.
Hmm.
And that's the basic answer. It's no different from if somebody gets into a very traumatic car wreck, maybe even somebody dies in it.
Hmm.
Whether you're a participant in the car wreck or you're just an observer, you witness it. Two people witnesses the same accident. One person develops PTSD from it, and another person doesn't.
Hmm.
So it's very individualized on what people will be able to handle in their nervous systems. And it has no reflection on their character or their strength, nothing like that. It just happens to be how your nervous system appropriates and stores the memory in your brain. Sometimes, for some people, the memory just gets filed away like any other experience. And for others, it's like a grenade or shrapnel going off, and it just cuts into the different parts and it messes some of the wiring up.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. I mean, I've heard about like, you can actually be born with trauma or even experience it in the womb. So I wonder, or obviously parenting too. So I wonder, yeah, I mean, there's got to be like, a whole bunch of different factors for people that experience that. But I'm certainly not an expert on the topic. um, but yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I appreciate that. So let's talk about like original sin. Okay, so a lot of people believe that, obviously. Okay, um, but there are some people that really struggle with that idea, and I seriously relate to that. Like, there's something about it, and of course, in the Calvinistic circles with total depravity, that
Mm.
like some people really, really struggle. Like, get the impression like, hey, like you're worthless, like you're an evil person, you deserve hell, essentially. And like some people really struggle with that. Can you talk about like what's really causing that, and like why do people like respond so negatively to that?
Well, I would argue it probably goes to, excuse me, I would probably argue that it goes towards a sense of shame and guilt
Hmm.
that is just touching something very deep,
Hmm.
something very young inside of us. Uh, this notion that you have already failed, you've
Oh
already
wow,
messed
yeah.
up. And not just that, you are worthy of eternal torment.
Hmm.
Whether you're thinking hell has an actual lake of fire or if it's just this outer darkness kind of thing, whatever, you still imagine it as the gnashing of teeth, this
Hmm.
place that is not good. And you're already at the beginning of your life a failure, miserable.
Yeah.
This then creates a rather toxic, codependent relationship between you and God.
Hmm.
The idea that I am absolutely nothing without God. I can never be anything without Him. He is one who completes me. And if I don't love Him back, He will mess me up bad. If this were said of a boyfriend or a girlfriend, it would be immediately recognized as toxic and abusive.
Hmm.
And why this is also why we see domestic violence and domestic abuse survivors have PTSD quite a bit because of these types of power dynamics and these types of toxic environments that they're being exposed to constantly. Well, the same thing for you and God. You're the failure, you're the sinner, you're the bad one right from the start.
Hmm.
Now imagine, now imagine as you get older, let's say you struggle with pornography or something, some other. And no matter how fervently you pray, you fast, you pray, you attend church, you get anointed with oil, you have the hands laid on you, everything. And yet you still can't beat the temptation. You still watch pornography. The amount of shame and
Hmm.
guilt that you your body endures it. It's like a shotgun blast to your chest. This is literally changing your body and your brain. It is making you, it's going to make you depressed, anxious. You cannot endure and just remain in a constant state of guilt and shame without it having lasting adverse effects on you.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really deep. So, um, um, like, so you talked about, yeah, I mean, okay, so first, that makes absolute total sense. Like, if you're told that you are absolutely a terrible person, uh, what is it? The heart is desperately wicked. People use that. I mean, I don't know what your opinion is on that, but, I'd say a lot of times it's very out of context. But there's a thing about it, like, you're evil basically from birth, and the only way that you could ever do anything good is for God, and it's all God's doing. It's none of your doing. So I mean, in that way, it seems super reasonable to say that, okay, like, you're worthless and evil person. Um, but at the same time, on the other hand, like, Genesis 1, like, we're made in the image of God. So, like, you do have inherent value, like, and you get into all, like, the abortion topic or whatever. And um, so, like, I've never heard a preacher say, hey, like, you're absolutely evil and you're a terrible person and you have no value at all. Um, so, like, I mean, obviously, this isn't just like, a few preachers or whatever, just like not communicating well. Like, do you think this is just purely a communication issue? Um, or like, are these preachers just not communicating well? Or like, what am I missing there?
Well, it could be that in a lot of cases, for sure.
Okay.
And that'll happen in any context, right? I think that there is something to be said about the notion that there are just simply toxic belief systems or toxic doctrines.
Hmm.
It's interesting when you talk about that you've never heard a preacher stand up and
Right.
say these things. And that's actually a fairly novel thing. That's a fairly new thing. The millennial generation is really the first generation to those that go to church or had gone to church where they didn't hear that you are evil and that you are going to burn in hell and other horrific things from the
Mm-hmm.
pulpit. But we get reports all the time. It is still incredibly prevalent. It
Hmm.
is, in fact, what is stated at the pulpit a lot. And if it's not, let's say you have a pastor who has a bit more of a cuddly teddy bear version of Jesus, right? He's a little bit more progressive, let's say. You still have congregants. You still have the Bible. You still have it being brought up in passive conversation. Why do I need to go to church and be with God and all these things? Well, because if there's a heaven, then there might be a downside too.
Hmm.
So these things are still going to come up. I feel like you have to be fairly oblivious to not have been exposed to it at some point.
Wow. Yeah, I read Dr. Slade's book on hell, and he's talking about he quoted from Jonathan Edwards, I think it was,
You mean
and
Dr. Harris? Is it Mark
oh
Harris?
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. No, I thought it was Karras. Shoot,
Or I
whatever.
mean Harris. Yeah, you're right, Mark Harris.
Yeah, Mark Karras.
We
We
both
can
got
edit that out. I don't even know what I originally said, but anyways, so Dr. Karras's book, he quotes from Jonathan Edwards, and I was reading that. I was like, oh my gosh. No wonder you had so much religious revival. You were telling people they're going to hell and they're evil people if they don't repent. Like, that's definitely a motivation factor. But obviously, like, that's not healthy. Um, specifically on how you, like, even if it is true, it's still not healthy, and there's ways to communicate that. Um, yeah, that's just. It was really fascinating to hear that. Did you have thoughts?
Well, think about this. Some other studies have been done on
Okay.
adverse religious experiences, and one study that we cite in our sociological publication, some 71% of young children were being taught graphic portrayals of hell,
Huh.
Satan, demons, and that these were developmentally inappropriate. So they were not things that you would normally should expose a kid to. And this is unique, or this is ironic, since the people exposing them to these graphic things would also probably be the ones to say you shouldn't watch an R-rated movie because that's not, you
Oh
know.
my gosh. Wow.
Um, so yeah, this I think is a lot more prevalent than, and I'll tell you this: this is
Okay.
what's also scary and toxic. As you can imagine, I get a lot of hate mail. The Global Center for Religious Research sometimes does as well, and these are very devout, zealous people. I remember one time I got a letter, a handwritten letter in the mail, and it said, I saw your work on religious trauma, blah blah blah. I hope to traumatize people, is what the guy said. I hope they are so traumatized because otherwise they're going to burn in hell.
Hmm.
Um, that's gross. It's horribly ignorant. I would argue, it's mindsets like this and the prevalency of the abuses in the church, both big and small. That is why church pews are being emptied at an astonishing rate,
Huh.
right? But for a lot of people, they want it to be scary. They want it because they think they are doing a noble service when in
Hmm.
fact they're actually it's going to backfire on them.
Hmm. Okay, I can't remember who it was you interviewed. Maybe it was Karis, who you asked in the video. You were like, "Hey, is this effective?" And like, he was like, "Oh yeah, it's effective." You tell your child not to do something, and you hold that stick like it's gonna be effective. But obviously, it's not gonna be healthy down the line. So another, Jonathan Edwards, like that was effective. But I'm sure there was some ridiculous, religious trauma after that as well. Uh, so, like, I mean, if okay, whether, whether I or you think the view is true or not, the question is like, what is the best way to do that? What is the best way to communicate that? And like, say for a topic of hell, like, do you have any thoughts on how to communicate that well without like completely religious trauma destroying people's lives afterwards?
Well, I don't know if I'm the best person to be able to answer that. I'm not. I don't specialize in preaching or anything like that.
Yeah.
My immediate reaction is I'm not sure why it needs to be brought up.
Hmm.
Is that really what the gospel is? A get out of hell
Interesting.
card?
Yeah.
Are you're good and you love Jesus just so you don't burn?
Hmm.
Um, so I'm not so sure. Is it really the essential message? Is that really it? We like to think, or at least it's been argued, yeah, the gospel must talk about the sin and the possibility of hell. I'm not so sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. And as for if you do, honestly, I mean, that just really is part of the core identity of your denomination or whatever, and you feel like it must be preached.
Hmm.
I don't know what a good way of bringing something like that up.
Hmm.
You do, maybe it's a balancing act, kind of what you were discussing, the
Hmm.
image of God and how treasured you are, right?
Hmm.
So maybe it needs to be balanced. You don't
Yeah.
just talk about that. You talk about how much value and worth you still have.
Hmm. Um, why you mentioned the value and worth thing. So, just from experience, like my wife and people that I've talked to, like, you have there are a lot of people out there with image issues. Like, I've had to deal with that some myself. When when we're talking about that, like, there's a I've heard some psychologists say like there's almost like a bias toward yourself. It's
Mm.
like if you think that you're worthless and you hear someone say, "Oh, you're not worthless," like what is that going to immediately change your mind? No, like compared to if someone says you're worthless, it's like, "Oh shoot, no, you're right." And like you're almost biased. You don't hear the good stuff. You always hear the bad stuff. Um, so that, when you're talking about like why people respond differently, that comes to mind. But shoot, I forgot my question. Honestly, that's really awkward.
Well,
Um, yeah, go for it.
you know, uh, th- this is a known psychological thing. Actually a cognitive bias that we have here, where
Mm,
we remember and internalize negative experiences far more than we do positive ones. Our brains really are wired to highlight and emphasize
hmm,
negative stuff about the world, about others, about us, and it's a survival mechanism. But yeah, so if you uh, have any inkling about how bad you are, or what a sinner you are,
hmm,
it might be internalized and appropriated far more deeply
hmm.
than if you're told just how much God loves you and all that.
Right, right. So in that case, like if we are going to be giving these, sermons or whatever about hell and, you know, yeah, you do have to emphasize, like make it very important because there are some people out there that will really focus on that one negative thing you said, or even, of course, if it's the entire topic, it's even worse. But to really focus on a positive, like, that you're valued and all that. Yeah, it's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. Um, so, uh, yeah, let's little rapture just a little bit more, okay? So you talked about heights. I mean, is that the only reason why people freak out about that?
No, I would say paranoia, scrupulosity are the big ones that we're finding with in terms of judgment days, apocalypses, raptures, stuff like that,
Hmm.
tribulation periods.
Hmm.
The idea is that you are, in a way, in a constant state of hypervigilance.
Hmm.
And hypervigilance is not good for the brain or body. So if you're constantly told that at any moment the Lord is going to come back and he is going to judge you,
Hmm. Wow.
you are now finding yourself walking on eggshells all the time. Your body will not be able to sustain that.
Hmm.
So, hypervigilance, shame and guilt, paranoia, fear that you will be judged poorly at any second.
Hmm. Which, of course, then when you actually do mess up, which will happen inevitably, then you have like, oh shoot, the rapture could happen right now. What am I? Of course, and that might even be a good reason why the whole the rapture, uh, premillennialism, and Left Behind got so popular in a lot of ways. Which, of course, there's a lot of different reasons, but because people are so afraid of what's going to happen, and I guess maybe a sense of like, if I can learn more about it, then I can be prepared almost.
Hmm, interesting.
Yeah.
I actually, I would throw in a different theory about why that
Okay.
might be a bit more popular. Uh,
Okay, go for it.
it actually kind of is a bit of a self righteous torture porn.
What?
Seriously, when we think about Hal Lindsey, um, and the other big namers, right?
Yeah.
Tim LaHaye, the graphic portrayals of your enemies being vanquished and your enemies being steeped in rivers of blood and God taking vengeance on your enemies
Oh
while
boy.
vindicating you.
Hmm.
It's like torture porn. You feel a heightened sense of um, your ego is boosted up, a heightened
Right.
sense of your own power, your own righteousness when other people are getting their just dues.
That is something I never thought about because I was never in that. Thank God for that. That is so fascinating. Wow. That does make a lot of sense. But no, I definitely think there's probably 1,000 different reasons why that whole thing is popular. Um, okay, so yeah, every sin I do, I'm murdering Jesus on the cross. To some people, that's going to seem obvious that you don't tell a 3 to 8 or 10 or maybe even 15 or maybe even 20-year-old child that you don't tell them that. But at the same time, um, like that might not be as obvious to some people. So could you maybe go into detail what's so special about why you shouldn't tell a child that?
Well, first let's clear up it. The
Okay.
communication, the message is communicated multiple different ways.
True.
Same message, just different words. So sometimes you tell the kid you're making Jesus cry, or you don't use the word murder and torture.
Yeah.
You are saying he is hanging on the cross because of what you did.
Mm.
As you later learn, as you grow, you start to see because you went to your church's Easter play. You see what it looks like to make Jesus cry or to hang him on the cross.
Mm.
So it isn't hard for people to make that connection, even if they're not explicitly said, you're murdering and torturing Jesus.
Mm. Yeah.
But we also want to acknowledge that is actually what is being said in a lot of ways as well, graphic portrayals of
Mm.
it. So it is going along with the rapture. It is a teaching and a doctrine that might be toxic because it emphasizes shame and guilt. It emphasizes the potential for things like victim blaming, where let's say you were sexually abused, you were raped or molested. Well, did you commit the sin too now? I mean, you lost your virginity technically, didn't you? Are you a sinner? Did things like that? Or, I'll tell you a flip side to it, where you're also taught to forgive your abusers. You're also taught to forgive almost automatically and without the actual recovery, without the healing, without the
Mm.
reconciliation,
Yeah.
right? So we know that a ton of cases where if you sin, you've made Jesus cry. If they've sinned, your youth leader, your pastor, somebody else, your dad, who is an elder or a deacon at the church,
Mm-hmm.
when they've sinned against you, you need to forgive them. That's God's child. It almost always seems to be this: when you mess up, you're bad. God's going to come after you.
Mm.
When they're bad, God seems to protect the abuser. At least that's part of the communication. That's the message that gets received.
Hmm.
So, yeah, there's two sides to it. And again, is this a toxic belief that maybe isn't as essential or even as biblical as you might think?
Hmm. Yeah. So, uh, first thought is like, yeah, no, that makes complete sense why someone would come out of that feeling uh, less confident, less valuable in themselves. If someone is, every time something goes wrong for them, it's like, oh, forgive everyone else. Or when you do something to them, it's like, oh, you're a terrible person. Uh, almost like you're of less value than everyone else.
Yeah.
That's really, really fascinating to think about. So, um, yeah. So I've talked to a lot of people. Okay. Obviously, you're gonna have a lot of church people saying that, like, oh, praying and
Mm.
just fasting that'll heal your trauma. Uh, and I've heard a lot of people say, no, that does not work, and that's completely dangerous and terrible. At the same time, there are some people that, you know, they might they're struggling with their salvation, whether they're saved or not, and they pray about it, and the next day they, for
Yeah.
whatever reason, it seems reasonable to conclude that if you pray and the next day you're healed, it must be because of God. That's a reasonable thing to conclude. Maybe not right, but it's reasonable. So, can you talk about like how like this whole thing of praying for trauma, like it seems to work for some people, obviously it doesn't work for everybody, but it seems to work for some people. So like how can you say that just simply praying or whatever doesn't work? It's not what they need.
Yeah, great question. I'm going to say something that a lot of people aren't going to like to hear.
Okay.
We know for a fact
Okay.
that prayer or any other religious ritual will not heal your trauma. Even for
Hmm.
those who say that it has healed them, are going to still have the symptoms of trauma. In fact,
Hmm.
those who go to things like healing crusades or really kind of have that testimony of God having healed them, yeah, that testimony doesn't last for long.
Hmm.
We know this. So, trying to pray or fast, stand on God's word, other kind of ritual practices is about as effective as prayer is for healing an amputee.
Hmm.
Somebody gets their arm blown off in war, doesn't matter how much you pray, that arm isn't coming back. Why? Because trauma is a problem in the brain and your central nervous system. It is not a reflection of your faith, your
Hmm.
spirituality level, or your relationship with God. The organ in your head is it has been rewired and you need to wire it back.
Hmm.
And what we now know is that trauma cannot be fixed, even with talk therapy, psychoanalysis, or some of the or cognitive behavioral therapy. So some of the traditional types of talk therapies actually can make trauma worse. You need to see a trauma specialist, just like you would if you have cancer, tumor, broken bones.
Hmm.
A trauma specialist knows how the brain works and can help repair the neurological pathways. So, my favorite analogy for this trauma works like this. Imagine your brain is kind of like a snow covered hill or a snow covered mountain, and people are skiing down it, right? Well, as time goes on, the skiers make an embedded groove in the side of that mountain so that a lot of times skiers are going down the same path. It's a groove. And that's exactly how our brains work. Our brains create neural pathways, much like the skier tracks. And so your brain automatically will associate certain smells to certain feelings, certain memories to certain physical manifestations, whatever. Same thing with trauma. Trauma has done, and this can happen because of one intense experience or a lifetime of exposure to violence and abuse, where a track is made, a connection is made with your fight or flight or fawn mode and the experience. Okay, so now we know how the brain is working.
Hmm.
What we need to do is cover the brain with snow again. Trauma specialists like EMDR or somatic therapy are designed to put a fresh layer of snow on your brain so that your brain can cover up the tracks leading from the trauma to the reaction, the triggers,
Hmm.
and you make different connections. So that way, if you happen to sin, you don't go into an immediate panic. You drive by a church, you're not immediately angered and flustered.
Hmm.
Um, your brain will make new pathways. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, perfect sense. The technical word neuroplasticity. Uh, so yeah, that's really interesting and very helpful. So, just while we're on the topic, where can people find this? Like, if you've experienced trauma, I mean, do you think that's at all something you can fix yourself?
No,
Really?
no.
Okay.
I mean, you can't fix your own trauma. You're not going to be able to think or pray or talk your way out of trauma.
Hmm.
That it is a it is a physical thing happening to your body and to your
Hmm.
brain. So,
Fascinating. Okay.
um, and luckily, we now know enough about this stuff that there are a lot of good resources out there, wonderful trauma specialists and trauma therapists who love their and are excellent at doing things like EMDR.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So basically, what should you Google EMDR?
Yeah, Google it.
Uh, just see who's in your area. I mean, I would assume like some are covered by insurance and some aren't. Um,
Yeah,
mm,
absolutely. Yep. And
okay.
it's very much just Google EMDR specialist in my area, something like that.
Mm,
Yeah.
okay. So I know some like you have a bunch of YouTube channels out there, like meditation. A lot of
Mm.
people have said a big one. Or uh, uh, Dr. Karras, in his class on shame that you guys did, he gave like there's like a website, and I'll put it on the screen. It's talk about like shame and like things you can do, like walk yourself through. I guess talk about like more of like acceptance of your being nicer to yourself than just like you would other people. Um, are you saying that like you don't think that can help either?
No, no, no. It
Okay.
is not an exhaustive treatment for trauma.
Okay.
So let's liken it to maybe losing weight, right? Uh, for somebody who is on the extreme obese side of things and they can barely move, and so they need immediate surgery. They need to go in and get they need to get, I don't know, liposuction. I don't know. This is probably a bad analogy for for me to be using, but so something like an immediate surgery.
Yeah.
However, there are still healthy practices that you need to put in, or you're just going to revert back to the old ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, yeah, meditation is a phenomenal practice to incorporate into your life, regardless if you have trauma or not.
Mm,
So definitely there are things that you want to do. You want to have good, healthy boundaries, right?
mm,
And you want to not expose yourself to the same environments or people who are abusing or have abused you. Um, but just by having boundaries is not going to cure and heal
right.
the trauma that's already occurred.
Mm,
So the damage that has been done is going to be there until that gets fixed.
mm,
In the meantime, you definitely want to put in some better healthy practices.
right. Yeah. So like something comes to mind, like pornography, like the typical thing is like okay, pray, and also, you know, throw your computer out the window. What is it? Fireproof. The video there, if you ever saw that, and it's like sure, like that might solve that specific issue, but you're gonna still have that whatever's fueling that fire essentially. Bad pun intended. Um, uh, does it you think that's a good way to put it?
Yeah, it's a great way. Yeah.
Okay, cool, thank you. Um, yeah, are you familiar with any situations where religious trauma can actually cause people to be closed-minded to different beliefs?
It's a fantastic question. I'm not so sure. I have, give me a second.
We can edit this out, and you don't have to answer either. I can give you some examples that
Um,
I've thought of.
yeah, go. Yeah, give me an example of what you're talking about.
Okay, so this might not be trauma. I'm no expert. Okay, but like for example, if someone like is having doubts and like they end up losing the stop being a Christian, and then um, like they've experienced some other type of trauma, maybe not religious trauma, but maybe it is, and then like they're triggered by that, and in a conversation they're gonna have a hard time, you
Mm.
know, like think about it, like they're like the very first class, like different portions of your brain like literally get smaller, and I don't know how all that works. Like that's just one example. Like naturally you're gonna have a hard time thinking. Um, I would assume a lot of biases are affected by religious trauma. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Absolutely. So let's distinguish two things here.
Okay.
One, in the moment, if somebody is triggered, we're going to have volatile, oftentimes we'll have volatile responses and reactions, right? So that might be the fight mode. Imagine trying to reason with, if you've encountered
Right.
this yourself, when
Right.
somebody's enraged, right? That you can't reason with them. You're not going, you got to get away. There just
Right.
needs to be distance, right?
Mm.
That's because their brain has been hijacked.
Hmm.
They're not in control anymore. The same thing actually happens with somebody who shuts down and just completely dissociates.
Yeah.
Um, so that in the moment is definitely, regardless, I mean, it has nothing to do with belief systems necessarily or worldviews and doctrines.
Mm,
It's just a total hijacking of the brain. Your
mm,
brain is in survival mode.
mm.
And survival mode doesn't often always have to be violent. It
Yeah.
could just be, I'm going to get into a fetal position in a way, right?
True.
Um, so there's that element.
Mm,
Now, for just more of the long term negative effects of trauma, the everyday, I am living with a constant fear or shame or guilt or just a deep hatred for
mm.
God, for church goers and Christians, things like that. So most definitely,
True. Yeah.
instead of preaching the hellfire as winning people to Christ, you're
Mm,
actually going to push them away, and so there they are likely not going to want to step foot in a church ever again. They're
mm.
likely never going to want to associate with God or the Bible or
Right.
anything, right? So you've poisoned that well, if you will.
Mm,
Or what some of the other things that we see in terms of trauma, I talked about the guy who wrote me the hate mail, right?
right.
When we see this happen, people who send out hate mail to people and they're just gross, right?
Mm,
With the things that they say, we hope you die, we hope your kids, well, all these types of things.
mm,
That's oftentimes likely a trauma response as well.
mm,
And yet, what has happened for them, instead of maybe leaving the church, they have actually dug in and entrenched themselves in it even more. It's this codependency thing
mm.
where um, I've been traumatized by this, and I'm going to get into it even more. I'm going
Wow.
to absorb it even more
Mm,
and marinate in it. What that does is makes that person just as toxic and end up abusing others. They continue the cycle.
wow.
So, yes, it can close people off for sure on a whole bunch of different fronts.
Hmm. Right. So, in some ways, depending on the situation, a someone that is, you know, trying to be you're trying to convert them essentially. Obvious example, hell. If you don't become a Christian, you're going to hell. That can actually might convince some people, but those some people that get convinced might even like really, as you say, was it marinate in that or whatever, where like they've become like extreme jerks, like the
Mm.
opposite of what a Christian should be. And of course, when you see someone like that, the people that are jerks, you're gonna be like, oh, they're not a Christian anyways. So, so
Yeah.
like you talked them into it, but then you didn't really talk them into it, and that's funny, but also really sad and terrible. Um, that's really thank you for that. That's really good. So
And by the way,
yeah.
if you want to see examples of religious trauma in action,
Mm,
YouTube street preachers and people reacting and responding,
mm.
right?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
You're going to see volatile, um, kind of these knee jerk reactions to
Mm,
people, to the evangelists.
mm,
That's because these people have been damaged and hurt,
mm,
and that person is triggering them. That person, and it
mm,
actually it is nothing to do with the fragility or the wokeness of that person who's been triggered. Um, it is a fact that in their past, the people, God or his representatives, have done some serious harm to him or her. And so, a genuine compassion and love for your neighbor is to be aware of this, to be trauma informed,
yeah.
to know that you might represent something that is incredibly painful for others. And so you might want to consider these things before you enter professional ministry or as you
Mm,
continue in ministry.
yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. This is a big reason why I want to record and talk to these people. or you specifically, because a lot of people are struggling with it. I mean, I'd say that everyone struggles with some type of trauma in some way. Just from my personal experience, although I'm not an expert, so take with that with a grain of salt, I guess. I don't know. So yeah, that's all I got for you. Can you and direct people to your site to learn more about trauma and all the other stuff you're doing? Remind people where they can reach your stuff and how they can learn more about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you are a survivor or a sufferer of religious trauma, or you want to learn more about it or take steps for your own ministry, or maybe you're a clinician and you want to take steps in your own practice to be more informed and help prevent this or even help heal some of this stuff, you can go to gcrr.org/RT, and we have wonderful resources for you there.
Mm-hmm.
You can learn all about it, from the causes to the symptoms to treatment options for religious trauma.
All right, yeah, and once again, I absolutely like within the first 5 minutes, I was taking pictures of what was on the screen, and I was literally showing my wife. She's like, "Oh gosh, you watched one of those videos again." Uh, but yeah, so this has been great talking to you, Dr. Slade. Any last word before we sign off here?
No, just thank you so much for having me. And if this is you, if this resonates with you, just know you're not alone and resources
Mm,
are out there.
mm,
Otherwise, please be good to yourself, be patient and loving to yourself.
thank you for that. All right, thank you, Dr. Slade. I hope you have a great rest of your night. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.